Hello, welcome to Revenant Reads. I'm Vin, and this is the monthly reading wrap-up for April of 2024. So this is coming kind of late. We're already halfway through May. I usually am a little bit late with these things, but I'm a little bit extra late this time. It's just been very busy, and then last weekend into earlier this week, I wasn't feeling well, so didn't really want to be in front of a camera. So finally able to film now, and I have a pretty decent pile. Well, decent for me. April ended up being a very, very good reading month. Although some of these books, now it's been like a month and a half since I've read them. So I'm going to talk about them very briefly. All of these books I have other videos on where I explain them or discuss my thoughts in more detail. Those are usually the Fresh Read Kills videos. That's when I talk about things that I've recently finished reading. So if you're curious about more thoughts on any of these that I might have, you can definitely go and check those out. Just as a note, I don't generally call my book discussions reviews. They're very informal. You can probably tell right now this is all unscripted. I just do it on the fly. So anyhow, I have one work of fiction and all the rest are actually nonfiction. All of them, I think, except for my fiction selection, relate to quarter two of Historathon. So Historathon is a year-long reading event where we read, discuss, and celebrate nonfiction history, and we divide the year up into 4 quarters, with each quarter being 3 months long and looking at a different time period. So right now, quarter 2 is April, May, and June, and we look at basically the Middle Ages, or at least if you're looking at it from more of a Western standpoint. It's basically the year 500 to the year 1500, but you don't have to focus on Europe or the West. You can if you want to participate, you can read anything you want as long as it's nonfiction history and falls into those years, and it counts for quarter 2. So we'll start off with the fiction book that I read, and that is Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, a book which is, of course, very well known. And this is one of those books that I'm pretty sure, I don't know, I think I was supposed to read it in high school, but I didn't, or at least maybe we just discussed it in high school, because as I'm reading this, I know I wasn't remembering anything. There was one scene in here that involved Scrabble that seemed kind of familiar, but that's about it. I didn't even remember what a handmaid was when I went into this, so I'm pretty sure I didn't read it in high school. But I read this as part of the Banned Books Reading Challenge. So I looked at my TBR bookshelves, which just off camera over here are my general fiction TBR shelves, and I saw, I basically looked at the list of frequently banned books and saw what matched. And I had 10 books on there. They're technically you can call a banned book. And I figured, okay, I'm going to read those this year. Early in the year, I read Lord of the Flies, so this is the second one. And I read this with Dave from A Book Blather and Elaine from Cobalt Dragon. And it was a nice little group discussion, hearing their perspectives. And I did really like this. Like I said, I knew kind of about it generally. I never saw the Hulu series. I never saw the film adaptation. I think it went around 1990. So I was mostly a blank slate. I just kind of knew the image here, and I knew that women were basically repressed in this. That's about it. But this was I thought very well written. Sometimes it's very stream of consciousness, but it really shows this possible, I guess you could say, near future, even though we're basically in the 80s during this during this novel, but it's dystopian, and the United States of America has turned into a kind of strict Christian theocracy. There's been a violent coup that has taken over things, and there have been kind of perverted biblical retellings. Then women have basically been relegated as baby makers. Some of them are wives, some of them are like housekeepers, but the handmaid, especially, because fertility has been an issue, they are basically just baby makers. They're seen as walking wombs, and they are basically treated as such. And we see it all through the eyes of one particular handmaid. If you haven't read this, which most people have, I certainly would recommend it. Like I said, if you want to hear my more thorough thoughts, you can check out my video that I did on it. And I also read, now we're getting to the quarter 2 stuff for Historathon. The Women Troubadours by Bogin. Now, this was originally published in the 1970s. This edition was published around 1980. Although, as I said in my video about this, I'm pretty sure this is not an old printing. I think Norton is just basically publishing the same thing that's published since the 90s, which is kind of a mixed bag because some of the images in here, it can be very difficult to tell what you're trying to see. They're very dark. This was interesting. I didn't know much about the troubadour culture. I didn't know a lot about where it really took place geographically. I didn't know very much about what happened with southern France and the culture that was basically wiped out from the Albigensian Crusade. That stuff I find very interesting and something I want to definitely look more into. And we have in the beginning kind of introductory essay, which I had some problems with some of the things that were in there. I think there was some very outdated information. And then we have the Women Troubadours themselves. We have their poems on one side, and then we have the original language, which is not French. I'm blanking on what it's called at the moment, but you can definitely look it up yourself. And it was okay. I mean, the poetry's not going to knock you away. It's, you know, it's not the inherent quality of the poems themselves that draws you. It's the glimpse into the life of women during this time, and that's what makes them very valuable and interesting to read. So I think the topic is really interesting. I'm curious if there's more updated books that maybe would be a better place to start. I don't know. But this was a very mercifully short read. It was a very quick read, so you won't lose much time if you do read it. I also read this, Norse America by Gordon Campbell, the story of a founding myth. So this looks at the, kind of Viking discovery, I'm putting the air quotes out there for that, of North America. And it looks at the actual history and what we know archaeologically, and then it looks at how that has kind of turned into an enduring myth, or how it's been remembered by especially Americans later on, how it's been, kind of brought into maybe a discussion of white supremacy, also sort of like how people who are more anti-Catholic, they would use the Norse founding or discovery of America as a counter to Columbus and the more Catholic celebrated discovery. This is another one that was a very quick read, and we get images as well. Definitely very informative. I remember there being a lot of typographic errors, which, the copy editor could have done a better job with this, I think. And I kind of wish that it went a little bit more into how the white supremacy has shown itself outside of, he really focused on a few publications, a couple of books. I'd like to see more in-depth look at the culture. But anyway, this is a pretty good starting place, and it was an interesting read. And I read this, When the Dead Rise, Narratives of the Revenant from the Middle Ages to the Present Day by Christian Livermore. And this is published by Boydell and Brewer. This was something I thought was really good. I will warn you, it is very expensive if you don't get a deal on it. These books are not cheap. They're very niche kind of academic publications. This is not written for a general audience. This is an academic work. And thankfully, I love those footnotes there. But it basically looks at the Revenant and how it appeared in the Middle Ages, and then it traces it through things like the Protestant Reformation and then into the modern era. And we see how the Revenant changes. At first, the Revenant would kind of be a very, a religious visit, if there was a Revenant. It was basically to teach people the ways of God and bring them back to Jesus. But then, you start seeing the stories change over time, and it seems to be they're emphasizing more the horror aspects of them coming back. And you get the sense that they're kind of telling these not for moral reasons, but because they're finding the stories fun. And it goes deeper than that, but you can kind of continue that thread until the point where it's not religious at all, and we just have fun horror stories with revenants coming back. That's the super simple, overly simple version of what this book is talking about. But again, it's been over a month since I've read it, but I really, really enjoyed it. It was definitely one of my favorites last month. And I read The Year 1000, When Explorers Connect the World, the Globalization Began by Valerie Hansen. This was okay. She's in this book, she's basically saying that globalization, which we tend to think of as more modern phenomenon, began way back 1,000 years ago. And I don't think that she's necessarily wrong that the roots are there. The problem is the presentation. I felt like oftentimes we were kind of maybe losing focus, or couldn't see the forest for the trees. We get lost in minutia, and I couldn't always see how we were going to connect, how we were connecting back to the original thesis. So I think that I have nothing wrong with the premise. I just wasn't bowled over by the actual presentation of things. But I do think that she's probably right, that we could trace globalization far back before the modern times. It's just, again, I think it could have been a tighter work. And I read this, Robert the Bruce, King of Scots, by Ronald McNair Scott. This is originally published in the 80s, I believe, in Europe, and then it came out in around 82, and then, yeah, it came out in America, it looks like in 1989. And I really had a fun time with this. This is definitely a very general history. McNair Scott was not a historian. He was a literary critic, and this was kind of a passion project of his. And he definitely weaves together, he uses medieval sources, not all of them contemporary to Bruce, which I think is important. Some of them come hundreds of years later. But he definitely takes, he essentially takes all those different narratives, and he tells a very kind of fun, rollicking story that's very compelling. It's really actually is a page turner. And it is definitely not impartial. I mean, Bruce is the hero here. He speaks of him very fawningly. But that being said, there are definitely some things in here that you can tell are kind of apocryphal. You can, see where legend showed up, or if there is an interpretation that is far more favorable to Bruce, he'll definitely take that interpretation on things. This was my first foray into reading really about this time period and really into Scottish medieval history. I had known, of course, about Robert the Bruce from Braveheart, which I already knew going into this was a very inaccurate portrayal. And I had seen The Outlaw King, which was a very good movie. And I actually, after I read this, I rewatched Outlaw King, and I had a very deep appreciation for just how much they got right in that movie. Not everything. I mean, Edward II wasn't in that battle at the end. So they definitely put some things in there for dramatic effect, but still, a lot of it was actually pretty well done, pretty well realized. So yeah, I had a lot of fun with this. Definitely not an academic work, but a good time. Let's see, I also read this, Valkyrie, The Women of the Viking World. This is published by Bloomsbury by Johanna, Katrin, Fridriksdottir. I don't know if I'm saying that right. But this was a really good study, looking at women, again, within the, it says the Viking world. That can be debatable whether or not you call that sort of thing. I mean, even this image is very striking, but it is kind of misleading. One of the things that she does in here is say that, shield maidens were probably, they could have been mythical. We don't have a lot of hard evidence that they really existed. When they show up, it tends to be in sagas that take place many hundreds of years before the Viking Age. So she's basically, however, using the sagas, it's mostly the sagas. You see some archaeological stuff in here, but it is mostly an analysis of the sagas to look at what women's lives were like. And she organizes it really by like chronological age. So it's like, from birth all the way up to death, and then even a little bit after. We get things like magic and afterlife. And it's really interesting in that way. You just have to understand that when you're going into this, it is heavily saga-based. So, I say that as though I'm disappointed. I mean, it's, I get really excited by the archaeological stuff. So I will say, when the archaeological stuff came in, I was more enraptured. But I also love the sagas. So to be able to see an interpretation of the sagas was fantastic. But I would definitely recommend this if you want to learn about women within the Viking Age. So yeah, it was good. Now, I read this with a subscriber, Stephanie Cohen, and also Debs from Rainer Reed's stuff. One of my co-hosts for Storathon. And then finally, I finished off the month of April with the Saga of the Volsungs. And they're also included here as the Saga of Ragnar Lothbrok. Translated and introduction by Jackson Crawford. There's Jackson Crawford right back there. This is a legendary saga. Takes place many hundreds of years before the Viking Age. It doesn't take place in Iceland, it doesn't even take place in Scandinavia. It basically takes place in Germany, or, central Germany area. And with, basically distant memory of things that happened in the 5th century. But this is the story of, Sigurd and the dragon, and Brunhild. So much of what fantasy has pulled from, like Tolkien afterwards. We have magic rings, we have treasure-hoarding dragons, just fantastic stuff. Now, the way this is written, we have to understand that what we have here is the only surviving, complete copy of this. And it sometimes reads like a summary of the story rather than the actual epic itself. It can move at breakneck speed. It's a very, very quick read. I mean, there's 2 sagas in here, and look how thin this is. And there's an introduction, an extensive one. So, there's not a lot going in here, but it packs a great deal into a very small size. Now, the other legendary saga I had read was the Saga of Hrothkraki. And they're kind of comparable in a lot of ways. In the legendary sagas, you see far more supernatural. You see the gods showing up a lot more. What struck me most clearly with this is it feels like the kind of pagan origins are more preserved in this than they were in Hrothkraki. In Hrothkraki, when Odin would show up, he would be seen in a very negative light, and the author was almost apologizing for having these kind of pre-Christian stuff in there, and even trying to say that our heroes were like proto-Christians. Basically, they didn't really believe in these pagan deities, and you could feel him bending over backwards to basically make up for the fact that he had to show us pagan things. You don't get that in here. Odin is showing up left and right. He's very mysterious. If this feels far more like it's connected to the past in which it was originally conceived. It wasn't written down back then. It was written down by Christians much later, but it feels like the story's been preserved a lot more. But there were many different versions of it. After this, I read the Poetic Eddas. That's one of the first things I read in May, and just in there you can see many versions of this story that are different from what's in here, the things that have survived, or at least excerpts of it. So I really enjoyed this. I read this for Saga Long 2024, which is an annual event in which we read and discuss Icelandic sagas. And if people want to take a dive into the world of the sagas, this is a very short read. However, I think they should be aware that it's very different from the family sagas, which feel far more like proto-novels. They're much more grounded. There's some supernatural things that happen in there, but they're far more grounded in reality. So this is a quick read, but it's not exactly indicative of what a lot of other sagas are like. So that's it. So these are all the books that I read in April of 2024. Like I said, for me, this was a good month of reading. I hit one of those strides in the month where I was just kind of reading at a very, very quick pace and able to get through stuff. So May has not turned out that way for me. I've got a couple books down, but I'm not going to hit 8. But anyhow, in April I read The Handmaid's Tale, Women Troubadours, Norse America, When the Dead Rise, The Year 1000, King of the Scots, Rob the Bruce, Valkyrie, and the Saga of the Volsungs. And again, if you read any of these, I'd love to hear your thoughts. And as always, thank you, BookTube.